January 1945. The snow in the Ardennes was no longer white. It was churned into a gray-brown slush, soaked through with melted ice, diesel fuel, and the blood of thousands. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's final frantic gamble, had been stopped cold. American soldiers had held frozen ridgelines with nothing but rifles, overcoats, and rage. Bastogne had been relieved. The German salient was being squeezed from both sides. The mathematics of victory were now unmistakable. The Third Reich had spent its last reserves and lost. In the field hospitals and forward command posts, men allowed themselves the first cautious whispers of survival. The war in Europe would end this year, perhaps by summer. But inside the quiet rooms where strategy was made, something far more fragile than the German front was beginning to break. On the morning of January 7th, in a nondescript school building in Zonhoven, Belgium, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery prepared to address the press. He had requested the conference himself. His staff had urged caution. Brigadier Bill Williams, his intelligence chief, had warned him plainly. The Americans were still burying their dead. Tempers were raw. Any public statement now would land on open wounds. Montgomery listened, nodded, and proceeded anyway. He believed he was performing a necessary duty. British newspapers had begun to criticize Eisenhower's broad front strategy, suggesting that the Supreme Commander's refusal to concentrate force had invited the German attack. Questions were being asked in Parliament. Montgomery intended to defend Eisenhower, to clarify the record, to remind the world that the northern shoulder had been stabilized under unified command, his command. He entered the room wearing the denim smock of a paratrooper, beret tilted just so. Reporters from Britain, Canada, and a handful of neutral countries filled the seats. American correspondence had been kept to a minimum. The transcript would be released later. He spoke for nearly an hour without notes, his voice crisp, deliberate, almost pedagogical. "I employed the whole power of the British group of armies," he said. "This was a vital factor in the plan. You thus had one man in the north directing the battle." He described the initial German breakthrough, the danger to the Meuse bridges, the confusion on the American First Army's front. "As soon as I saw what was happening," he continued, "I took certain steps myself to ensure that if the Germans got to the Meuse, they certainly wouldn't get over it." He praised the American soldier generously. "I would like to say how well the American soldier fought. He has shown himself to be very tough indeed." But the framing was unmistakable. The picture he painted was of American armies reeling, retreating, only restored to order when a British commander assumed control and imposed method on chaos. The reporters took it down. The words traveled by cable and radio across the Atlantic in hours. In Bradley's 12th Army Group headquarters in Luxembourg, the transcript arrived like a shell burst. Omar Bradley read it in silence. He was not a man given to theatrics. Missouri restraint ran deep. But his staff saw the color drain from his face. His armies had absorbed the full weight of the initial assault. Hodge's First Army had been split. Patton had executed a near-miraculous 90-degree wheel in blinding snow to strike the southern flank. Thousands of American boys lay frozen in shallow graves along the ridgelines, and now their sacrifice was being presented as a footnote to British restoration. Bradley placed the transcript down carefully. "This is intolerable," he told his chief of staff. "If Montgomery is to command American troops permanently, then I must request relief." Word spread quickly. Patton, recovering from a minor car accident, but still commanding the Third Army, received a copy. His reaction was less measured. "That limey son of a bitch," he exploded to his aides. "He gets temporary command for a few weeks, and now he's the savior of the U.S. Army? I'll be goddamned if I serve under him." The fury was not confined to the generals. American correspondents who had been at the front, men who had seen the frozen bodies stacked like cordwood, filed stories of their own. Headlines began to appear. Montgomery claims credit for Bulge victory. American generals furious. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Versailles, the clippings landed on Eisenhower's desk in a thickening pile. Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff, brought the first batch personally. He had served with Montgomery in the Mediterranean and knew the man's habits intimately. "He's done it this time, Ike," Smith said quietly. "This isn't just ego. This is poison." Eisenhower read the transcript twice, then a third time. He had navigated coalition crises before, torch, Sicily, the drag-out fights over anvil and broad front versus single thrust. He had learned to swallow pride, to balance British exhaustion against American abundance. But this struck deeper. They bled, he thought, staring at the casualty reports still arriving daily. They held the line with frozen rifles and no winter coats. And now their story is rewritten by a man who watched from 20 miles back. He thought of the boys in the foxholes who would read these headlines. The sense of betrayal would travel down the chain faster than any order. Bradley telephoned that evening. His voice was calm, almost formal, but the meaning was unmistakable. "Ike, I cannot continue if this stands. My soldiers deserve better. If Montgomery is to have permanent command of American forces, then you will have my resignation." Patton followed with a blistering cable threatening the same. Eisenhower sat alone in his office long after the staff had gone. Outside, the gardens of Versailles lay under frost. He had the authority, absolute on paper. A single signal to 21st Army Group headquarters: Field Marshal Montgomery is relieved of command. Replace with Field Marshal Alexander. The justification was ironclad: deliberate public undermining of Allied unity at a critical moment. He could picture the draft: short, precise, impersonal. The kind of order he had signed 1,000 times, orders that sent divisions into fire, that accepted 10,000 casualties to gain a river line. But this order would be different. He understood, with a clarity that chilled him, what firing Montgomery would actually mean. It would not be seen as disciplining arrogance. It would be seen as the final American assertion of dominance, dismissing Britain's senior soldier at the very moment the war was being won. Churchill would have no choice but to defend him. Parliament would erupt. The press in London would howl about ingratitude. The coalition, already strained by years of compromise, would face its gravest crisis precisely when unity was most needed. And beyond Britain, Stalin would smile quietly in Moscow. The Red Army was racing toward Berlin. Any visible crack in Western solidarity would be exploited. Worst of all, perhaps, the American soldiers themselves. Their anger was righteous. Satisfying it with Montgomery's scalp might feel like justice in the moment, but it would come at the cost of the very alliance that had made victory possible. Eisenhower stared at the blank signal pad on his desk. He had supreme command. But for the first time, Eisenhower realized victory did not equal control. To understand why Eisenhower hesitated, one must first understand the man he contemplated removing and the nation that stood behind him. Bernard Montgomery had not risen to Field Marshal by accident. He was the product of a British army that had learned its lessons in the mud of the Somme and Passchendaele. Methodical, prepared, intolerant of amateurism. At El Alamein in 1942, he had taken a battered Eighth Army, trained it relentlessly, stockpiled overwhelming material, and only then attacked. The victory stopped Rommel cold and turned the tide in North Africa. It was the first major British land triumph of the war, and it made Montgomery untouchable in the eyes of his countrymen. He believed in clarity of plan, unity of command, and the absolute necessity of concentration of force. These were not quirks. They were articles of faith forged in the memory of 1914 to 1918, when British soldiers had been squandered by improvisation and divided direction. By 1944, however, the strategic landscape had shifted beneath him. The British Empire was exhausted. Its manpower reserves were drained, its industry dwarfed by American production. The United States was fielding 70 divisions in Europe to Britain's 15. The Royal Navy still ruled the seas, the RAF still bombed Germany. But on the ground, the war had become an American undertaking with British participation. Montgomery felt this shift acutely. He saw it not merely as a military reality, but as an existential threat to Britain's post-war standing. If the final campaign was fought and won under an American broad front strategy, if the Union Jack did not fly prominently over the decisive victories, then Britain would enter the peace talks as the junior partner. Grateful, indebted, diminished. He expressed this anxiety in private letters and staff discussions with a bluntness that startled even his aides. Britain, he believed, must retain a separate identity within the alliance. She must be seen to contribute decisively, or she would be relegated to the margins of the New World Order. This was not mere vanity. It was a conviction shared in Whitehall and Downing Street. Winston Churchill, now 70 years old and fighting for his political life, watched the balance tilt with growing alarm. He had bound Britain's fate to America in 1940 when all seemed lost, but he had never intended permanent subordination. The empire still spanned a quarter of the globe. Britain had invented modern coalition warfare. She could not be reduced to a satellite. Churchill articulated the fear in quieter moments. If Britain emerged from the war as America's loyal lieutenant rather than her equal partner, the empire would unravel faster than any of us could staunch the bleeding. Montgomery became the vessel for that fear. He was the senior British ground commander, the victor of El Alamein, the only figure who could plausibly demand a leading role in the final act. To diminish him was to diminish Britain herself. His chief of staff, Major General Francis de Guingden, a diplomat where Montgomery was abrasive, understood this better than most. De Guingden had spent the war smoothing the Field Marshal's edges, translating his certainties into language the Americans could accept. He knew Montgomery's public utterances were not calculated insults, but defensive reflexes. Every time Montgomery insisted on a single thrust rather than Eisenhower's broad front, every time he reminded the press of British contributions, he was fighting a rearguard action for relevance. In January 1945, that reflex became fatal overreach. Montgomery did not believe he had crossed a line at Zonhoven. In his mind, he had praised the American soldier, defended Eisenhower against British critics, and stated plain facts. He had been given temporary command of 2 American armies, and under his direction, the northern shoulder had held. He underestimated how those facts would sound to men who had just buried half their platoons. Back in London, the first cables from SHAEF arrived at 10 Downing Street. Churchill read them over breakfast, pipe clenched, eyes narrowing. He summoned his military secretary and dictated immediate inquiries. What exactly had Montgomery said? How severe was the American reaction? The answers came quickly. Severe. Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial General Staff and Montgomery's longtime patron, was summoned. Brooke had defended Montgomery through every previous crisis, Mediterranean, Normandy, Arnhem. He understood the man's flaws but valued his victories. Now he warned Churchill plainly. If Eisenhower moved against Montgomery, the government would have to choose between its most successful field commander and the supreme Allied commander. Churchill paced the map room, maps of the shrinking Reich spread before him. He knew Roosevelt would back Eisenhower. The president had no desire to alienate the U.S. Army on the eve of victory. Congress was already restless about European entanglements. Yet Churchill also knew that sacrificing Montgomery would ignite a storm in Parliament. The conservative backbenches would cry betrayal. The press barons, Beaverbrook especially, would feast on American arrogance. Labor would quietly rejoice at imperial humiliation, but the damage to national morale would be real. More than morale, leverage. The post-war world was already taking shape. Lend-Lease would end, Britain would need loans, trade agreements, security guarantees. To enter those negotiations having publicly capitulated on the battlefield would weaken every British argument. Churchill drafted a note to Eisenhower, careful, affectionate, but firm. He would not yet demand Montgomery's retention. He would first probe the depth of the crisis. Eisenhower received it and felt the weight settle heavier. He had always respected Churchill's strategic insight, admired his defiance in 1940. But now the Prime Minister was defending not just a general, but a symbol. Montgomery, for his part, remained oblivious to the gathering storm. At 21st Army Group headquarters, he continued planning the next offensive, confident that truth would prevail. His staff watched uneasily as days passed without response from SHAEF. De Guingden finally confronted him. "Sir," he said quietly, "this time you may have gone too far. The Americans are talking resignation. Eisenhower is under real pressure." Montgomery's response was characteristic. "Nonsense, Freddie. Eisenhower knows I'm right. He'll calm them down." But de Guingden saw what Montgomery could not. The Field Marshal had become more than a commander. He had become the last visible assertion of British martial primacy in a war that was slipping from British hands. To remove him was not to discipline a subordinate. It was to acknowledge, publicly and irrevocably, that Britain's day as an equal had passed. Montgomery was not just protected, he was symbolic. The crisis that erupted in January 1945 was not born in a single press conference. It was the culmination of 18 months of friction, compromise, and unspoken resentment, a slow erosion that had worn the alliance thinner than any German counterattack ever could. To trace its origins is to return to the beaches of Normandy, June 1944. The invasion succeeded beyond expectation, but the breakout did not. Seine, Montgomery's D-Day objective, remained in German hands for weeks. His 21st Army Group hammered against it in a series of set-piece battles, Epsom, Goodwood, Bluecoat, each promising the decisive rupture that never quite materialized. Montgomery described these operations as deliberate attrition, designed to pin German armor while American forces broke out to the west at St. Lo. The strategy worked eventually. Cobra shattered the German line. Patton's Third Army poured through the gap. By August, the Wehrmacht in Normandy was encircled at Falaise. Yet the cost was unevenly distributed. British and Canadian armies had fought a brutal grinding match against the bulk of German panzer divisions. Their casualties were heavy, their manpower irreplaceable. American forces, arriving in endless waves, took Avranches, turned north, and reaped the dramatic encirclement. Montgomery saw it as planned. Many Americans saw it as British armies bogged down while American mobility won the campaign. The seeds were planted. Then came the pursuit across France. Supply lines stretched, ports were devastated. The Allied advance outran its logistics. Montgomery proposed Comet, a smaller airborne operation to seize Rhine bridges. Eisenhower, under pressure to keep momentum, expanded it into Market Garden. The plan was vintage Montgomery: meticulous preparation, overwhelming air support, a narrow corridor driven deep. He promised it would end the war by Christmas. Eisenhower approved against his better judgment. He had just granted Montgomery priority in supplies to clear the Scheldt estuary and open Antwerp, the logistical lifeline without which the entire front would stall. Montgomery delayed the Scheldt to pursue Market Garden. Eisenhower relented, partly to maintain harmony, partly because the political cost of another veto was rising. The operation launched on September 17th. For 3 days it seemed possible. Then the weather closed in. German resistance at Nijmegen and Arnhem stiffened beyond intelligence estimates. The British 1st Airborne Division was cut off at Arnhem. Relief columns fought yard by yard up Hell's Highway. By September 25th, it was over. Arnhem was lost. Over 10,000 casualties, the majority British and Polish. The corridor gained was a vulnerable salient, useless without the Rhine crossing. In the aftermath, Montgomery's public statement was measured. In this battle, the Allied armies have sustained a notable reverse, but the ultimate aim has been achieved. Privately, he blamed intelligence, weather, and the slow advance of flanking armies. To American ears, it sounded like deflection. Patton, whose Third Army had been starved of fuel during the operation, was apoplectic. Bradley quietly seethed. The Scheldt remained uncleared until November, after bitter Canadian fighting in flooded polders. Antwerp opened too late to prevent the autumn stalemate. Market Garden became the symbol of British overreach, of resources diverted for a narrow thrust when broader pressure might have unhinged the entire German front. Eisenhower said nothing in public. He absorbed the criticism, adjusted plans, and moved on. But the incident lodged in the American command structure like a splinter. Montgomery, undeterred, continued to press for a single thrust north of the Ruhr, 40 divisions under one commander, himself, driving to Berlin. Eisenhower refused. He believed in the broad front for military reasons. Multiple threats, shorter supply lines, the need to clear the Saar and reach the Rhine on a wide axis. But there were political reasons too. The American armies now outnumbered British forces 4-1 on the ground. The American public, Congress, the President, all expected American commanders to lead the final advance. To place the main effort under Montgomery would have been politically impossible. Each refusal deepened Montgomery's conviction that American strategy was wasteful, substituting material for skill. Each compromise deepened American resentment that British caution was prolonging the war. By late autumn 1944, the front had congealed along the German border. The Hürtgen Forest became a meat grinder for American divisions. Aachen fell after house-to-house fighting. Metz held out longer than expected. Men fought in rain and mud with thinning supplies. Montgomery's armies, opposite the Reichswald and the northern plain, prepared methodically for Operation Veritable, but slowly. Manpower shortages forced the disbandment of divisions. British infantry battalions were reduced in size. Montgomery wrote to Brooke in London, "We are fighting this war with our hands tied behind our backs." Brooke understood. Churchill understood. They all felt the empire's exhaustion, the creeping realization that the war would be won by American power and Russian numbers. In December, Hitler launched his Ardennes offensive through the weakly held American sector. Eisenhower's response was swift and decisive. Temporary transfer of 1st and 9th Armies to Montgomery for the northern shoulder, while Patton struck from the south. The decision saved the situation but carried inevitable risk. American troops under British command, even briefly, was a raw nerve. Montgomery performed well. He refused premature counterattacks, built up reserves, coordinated methodically. The shoulder held, but he could not resist the narrative. His staff watched with growing unease as he prepared the January 7th press conference. De Gingen begged him to cancel it. Montgomery refused. "The truth must be told," he said. The truth, as he saw it, was that unified command had restored order. He did not see how that truth would sound to men who had held Bastogne with frozen feet and empty stomachs. As the transcripts reached Versailles, Eisenhower sat in his office reviewing the long chain of events. Normandy delays, Market Garden, the supply arguments, the broad front debates. He saw the pattern clearly now. Every compromise had preserved unity at the cost of resentment. Every indulgence had fed Montgomery's sense of indispensability. Every restraint had eroded American trust. The alliance had endured because no single incident had been fatal. But the weight had accumulated, silent and relentless. Bradley's resignation threat was not bluster. Patton's fury was not theater. If Eisenhower ignored this, the fracture would spread downward to the soldiers themselves. If he acted, the fracture would spread upward to governments. He looked at the map on his wall. The front lines, the shrinking Reich, the Red Army advancing from the east. The military enemy was collapsing, but the political enemy, the fragility of coalition, the limits of authority, the cost of justice, was stronger than ever. By January 1945, Eisenhower knew the enemy was no longer Germany. January 10, 1945, Supreme Headquarters, Versailles. The building was quiet in the late evening, the corridors emptied of staff. Only the faint clatter of teletypes and the occasional murmur of duty officers broke the silence. Eisenhower sat alone in his office, a single desk lamp casting a hard circle of light over papers, maps, and a half-empty pack of cigarettes. On the blotter before him lay a single sheet of paper. Typed, clean, precise. Top secret, 2. 21st Army Group Field Marshal Sir Bernard L. Montgomery is relieved of command effective immediately. Field Marshal Sir Harold Alexander will assume command of 21st Army Group. It was short. No recriminations, no explanations. Just the order. Bedell Smith had drafted it that afternoon, at Eisenhower's quiet instruction. The justification cable to the combined chiefs of staff was already prepared. Repeated public statements undermining Allied unity, culminating in the January 7th press conference that had provoked threats of resignation from senior American commanders. The authority was unquestionable. Eisenhower was supreme commander. Montgomery served at his pleasure. Yet the paper had sat unsigned for hours. Eisenhower stared at it as though it were a live mine. He had signed far harder orders, orders that sent the airborne into Arnhem, orders that accepted the slaughter in the Hurtgen, orders that launched the invasion of Normandy knowing the first waves would be decimated. This one was different. It would not kill men. It might kill something larger. The telephone rang. He let it ring twice before lifting the receiver. It was Bradley. "Ike," Bradley said, voice low and steady. "I've thought it over. If Monty stays in place without consequence, I don't see how I can face my soldiers. I'll submit my resignation in the morning unless something is done." Eisenhower thanked him, promised a decision soon, and hung up. Minutes later, a cable from Patton arrived via secure teletype. "If that bastard remains, I will request relief. Stop, my men deserve better. Stop." The threats were not bluff. Bradley was the most restrained of men. If he was prepared to walk, others would follow. A cascade of resignations from American Army commanders would shatter SHAEF's credibility. Congress would investigate. The press would amplify every grievance. Roosevelt, already ill, would be forced to intervene, and Stalin would watch with satisfaction as the Western Allies tore at themselves on the eve of final victory. Eisenhower lit another cigarette and paced the room. He understood the moral imperative. American soldiers had borne the surprise of the Bulge. They had held the critical shoulders, relieved Bastogne, closed the salient. To let Montgomery's words stand unchallenged was to erase their sacrifice. It was to tell them that their blood purchased only silence. Justice demands action, he thought, but justice in a coalition is never clean. Churchill's first message had arrived that afternoon, warm, avuncular, laced with concern. "My dear Ike," it began. "I hear disturbing reports of misunderstanding. Montgomery's words were perhaps infelicitous, but his intent was to defend your strategy against domestic critics. I know you will handle this with the wisdom that has guided us thus far." It was not yet a demand. It was a warning shot. Eisenhower knew the next message would be sharper. If he signed the order, Churchill would fight. Parliament would be recalled if necessary. The government might fall over it. Churchill had staked his prestige on Montgomery before. The press lords would frame it as American ingratitude. Britain stood alone in 1940, bled at Dunkirk, El Alamein, Italy, and now her greatest soldier dismissed at the moment of triumph. The alliance would survive perhaps, but scarred, distrustful, weakened at the precise moment the post-war order was being shaped. De Guingand telephoned from 21st Army Group late that night, unofficial, urgent. "Sir," he said, voice tight, "the Field Marshal still doesn't grasp the gravity. He thinks it will blow over, but if you relieve him, it will not be seen here as discipline. It will be seen as the end of Britain's equal partnership. Churchill will have no choice but to defend him publicly. The consequences." He trailed off. Eisenhower listened in silence. "Freddie," he said finally, "tell him the resignations are real. Tell him Bradley and Patton are prepared to go. Tell him I have the order in front of me." De Guingand's sharp intake of breath was audible. "You have it drafted?" "Yes." A long pause. "Then God help us all," de Guingand whispered. "I'll speak to him at once." The line went dead. Eisenhower returned to his desk. The order still waited. He imagined the sequence. Sign it, send it, watch the storm break. Alexander would take command smoothly. Competent, diplomatic, the armies would continue the advance. Germany would still collapse, but the precedent would be set. An American supreme commander removing a British field marshal over words. Future coalitions would remember. Britain would remember as she negotiated loans, bases, atomic secrets. And the soldiers, the American soldiers who deserved vindication, would gain a hollow victory, their anger satisfied at the cost of the unity that had made victory possible. He thought of Roosevelt, frail now, focused on the United Nations, on binding the world after the war. The president would back him, but quietly urge restraint. Alliance durability mattered more than battlefield fairness in the long calculus. Every hour that passed without decision raised the stakes. The longer he waited, the more the crisis solidified. British opinion hardened, American resentment deepened. The telephone rang again. This time London, Alan Brooke. "Ike," Brooke said gravely, "Winston is preparing a strong representation. He believes this could bring down the government. I implore you, find another way." Eisenhower assured him he sought only unity. He hung up and stared at the order once more. The paper seemed heavier now, as though it absorbed the weight of every call, every cable. He had the power to end Montgomery's career with a stroke of the pen. But he understood, with a clarity that settled like winter cold, that exercising that power would expose the alliance's deepest fragility. That supreme command was real only as long as no one tested its limits too far. The order was complete. The decision was not. January 13th, 1945. The crisis had stretched across 6 days. 6 days of cables, telephone calls that crossed the channel in the dead of night, and silences that carried more weight than words. At 21st Army Group headquarters, Francis de Guingand had worked without pause. He had confronted Montgomery directly, laying out the resignations, the drafted order, the brink upon which the alliance stood. For once, the field marshal listened without interruption. The color drained from his face as the implications sank in. "They would actually relieve me?" he asked quietly. "Yes, sir," de Guingand replied. "And if they do, Churchill will fight, but he may not win. The Americans hold the armies now. We cannot force the issue without breaking everything. Montgomery paced his office, beret in hand. He had always believed his candor served the greater good. Now he saw it might end his war. That evening, he dictated a letter. Not an apology in the conventional sense. Montgomery was incapable of groveling, but a carefully worded retraction. He praised Eisenhower's strategic direction of the campaign. He emphasized his admiration for American fighting qualities. He expressed regret for any misunderstanding caused by his remarks. De Guingand edited it ruthlessly, softening edges, removing any lingering self-justification. The final version was politically sufficient. Morally, it was incomplete. The letter reached Versailles the following morning. Eisenhower read it alone. Then he summoned Bedell Smith and Kay Summersby, his driver and confidant, the only two people in whom he allowed glimpses of private doubt. "It's not enough," he said quietly. "It doesn't give Bradley what he needs. It doesn't undo the damage to the soldiers." Smith nodded. "But it gives you what you need, Ike. A way out." Eisenhower walked to the window. Outside, the frost still clung to the lawns of the Trianon Palace. He thought of the order still locked in his safe. He thought of the resignations waiting to be submitted. He thought of Churchill's next cable, already being drafted, pleading for unity. Two forms of damage, he thought. Act and fracture the coalition at the moment of victory. Enact and accept that authority has limits, that some offenses cannot be punished without greater harm. He returned to his desk, unlocked the drawer, removed the single sheet. For a long moment he held it, feeling its slight weight. Then he tore it in half, once, twice, again until the pieces were small enough to burn. He dropped them into the metal wastebasket and touched a match to them. The flames curled briefly, consuming the words that would never be sent. Smith watched in silence. "Tell Bradley and Patton the matter is settled," Eisenhower said. "Montgomery has clarified his remarks. The alliance stands." Bradley accepted with quiet grace. Patton grumbled but complied. Churchill received the news with profound relief. He sent a warm note of thanks, promising eternal gratitude. Montgomery resumed planning the Rhine crossing. He never spoke publicly of the incident again. But in private, with de Guingand, he acknowledged the lesson. "I was too clever by half, Freddie. Next time, I'll keep my mouth shut." There was no next time. The war ended 4 months later. Montgomery survived, but diminished. He commanded 21st Army Group to the Baltic, accepted the German surrender at Lüneburg Heath, and received his Field Marshal's baton. Yet he was never again fully trusted by the Americans. Eisenhower's inner circle spoke of him with cool detachment. The post-war memoirs, American ones especially, remembered the press conference more clearly than the victories. Eisenhower preserved the alliance intact. The broad front advanced. The Rhine was crossed. Berlin fell to the Soviets, but the Western armies reached the Elbe. Victory came on May 8th, unconditional and complete. The compromise was buried in classified files and private memories. History recorded the triumph, not the silence it required. Eisenhower carried the knowledge alone. In his memoirs years later, he wrote only a few restrained paragraphs about coalition difficulties, never naming the moment he tore the order. But in quieter reflections, letters to old comrades, conversations with Mamie, he returned to it. Power, he would say, is not the ability to destroy your enemies. It is the ability to absorb what you cannot destroy without becoming something worse. He had won the war, but he had learned that supreme command was bounded, that authority without enforceability was a kind of performance sustained only by the willingness of others to pretend the limits did not exist. In the end, Eisenhower didn't defeat Montgomery. He absorbed him. Leadership is not choosing what's right, it's choosing what endures. Eisenhower won the war, but learned power has borders. Subscribe for more moments where history turned on what leaders could not do.